Hello, I would like to introduce the àradh, which is a new 6 HP filter module that I've been hoping to get out for the past couple of years, but the supply chain shortage really slowed things down with this one. It was actually production ready technically back in 2020. So a bit of a quirky one. This is essentially the spiritual successor of the tràigh low pass filter, which is the first filter that I designed as Instruō, and it's been discontinued for quite a while now. But yeah, it's a very traditional East Coast low pass filter transistor ladder architecture. The tràigh itself used to use some LM3046 matched transistor ICs, which were discontinued, which meant this had a limited life cycle of it. So I've basically copied the same filter topology of this, but this is using more standard discrete transistors. So, you know, discrete is better. Yeah, so a few tricks up the sleeve with this one. It can function as a more fundamental basic filter module, but there's a built-in VCA, so kind of trying to bridge the line between East Coast transistor ladder subtractive synthesis and a more West Coast low-pass gate approach, where low-pass gating is dynamic amplitude modulation or amplitude reduction in tandem with filtering. So you're able to close the filter all the way to get silence. So East Coast subtractive filtering as well as West Coast low-pass gating. The additional quirk with this is in the form of dynamics management. So essentially designed this to act as a compressor as well, where we've got a built-in envelope follower or threshold-based gate detection over envelope following over the throughput audio amplitude. And it's internally normaled or externally patchable through this extra follow jack here. So you can use this as a compressor or a noise gate or a expander. But the fact that it's a low-pass filter, you get sort of spectral behavior where you're able to not just affect dynamics, but also spectrum based on incoming signals and amplitude following. So yeah, I'll stop talking now and let future me talk about this module in a bit more depth. I'm going to try a few things with the format of this video. So next up, there's going to be a section that is going to be an in a nutshell quick start guide, essentially. So hopefully that will serve as a section that can be revisited just as a refresher on the button combinations, color scheme, and labeling and stuff. So hope you enjoy. Cheers. Okay, before we go off on some deep dives on how the àradh works, I thought it would be useful to do a section that's more of a quick reference overview of the quick start guide. Sort of the basic in a nutshell ins and outs. Here are the button combos, blah, blah, blah. So first off, let's look at the initialization command, or like factory reset. So say you've got some sort of settings, you're not sure if you've got your envelope follower set to pre or post filter, you don't know whether you've got secondary CB assignment, you want to get to a blank slate, press and hold both buttons, starting from small, so small, then big, and then rattle the toggle switch. I think it actually is looking for 3 or 4 different state changes. I can't remember how I programmed it, but I did it so that you could just quickly press, toggle like that, and you're back to initialized state. So let's check that for reference. I'll set primary assignment to both VCA and filter for CV, and I've got secondary assignment to both resonance and decay. So now, if I press and hold both, it's cleared that, and it's cleared that. So the parameters that get reset with this are primary and secondary CV assignment, attack, release, and threshold values for the follower and gate output, and also the position of the envelope follower's derivation, so whether that's pre or post filter. So I thought it might be useful to go into a bit of a more condensed overview of the ins and outs of the àradh before this video really gets into more sectional. It's looking at particular examples. So setup here, we're listening to the tràigh controlled by the harmony, and that's my paraphonic chordal voice, and then I'm using the àradh as both VCA and filter. Nice classic resonant filter subtractive voice. Okay, let's work our way through. I've got the raw signal from the tràigh going through the red channel on the scope, and then the yellow channel is the output from the àradh itself. I'll move this just now. So to start with, we have our audio input here in the bottom left. Diagonally up from it is the output. That's our audio throughput. And the àradh itself is both a filter and VCA. So this is where it will run into VCA then filter, or filter then VCA, depending on how they're oriented. So that's using this little switch here with pre and post. So pre is kind of where I designed this with a sort of as much of a default configuration in mind. Just because transistor ladders sound really good when you drive a signal into them quite hot. So this kind of having the VCA before gives you the ability to add a good bit extra headroom going into the discrete transistors. So in out, the top section, or the section just above the in and out section, is the filter control. So that's got our single filter cutoff knob, got resonance, I'll mute my delay for a sec, just so we're hearing it dry. The ping pong delay, it sounds a little bit like there's parallel multi-peaks going on, which is quite nice. We have a volt per octave jack. So kind of the intended use case of this is for key tracking, a more traditional configuration where you would want to use, take the resonance down a bit, have your cutoff frequency follow the same volt per octave that your fundamental notes are. That way you retain a bit more consistency of stop band in relation to core frequency. But it can also, of course, act as a pitch control. If we make sure that's muted. Okay, I'll keep my bias all the way down so we don't hear any of the tràigh going into the filter. Kick resonance all the way up. And it's got the ability to oscillate as a very stable sine wave. It's not the highest of amplitudes, but yeah, and that's that volt per octave is able to act as a more traditional pitch control. Let's just send it random CV from sample and hold. Spooky sine waves. Cool. But yeah, like the volt per octave being there, that was kind of with a more traditional key tracking configuration in mind. Let's jump up to the top section here, where we have our CV control. I've actually got it labelled on the panel as VCA. I decided to go with that just because of the topology and the kind of implementation of the àradh. It is very much designed with VCA control from CV with the bias adjacent for a fundamental offset of our VCA as a bit more of a primary control. But the CV input is a little bit more versatile than just CV over VCA. So I'll unpatch that just now. So we have our CV input, which is labelled as CV or FM, and it can actually be mapped to, so this is parameter mapping of our CV, which comes in here and gets attenuverted. So we have an attenuverted version of our CV amplitude. And that attenuverted CV can be mapped to up to 4 parallel destinations, 4 parallel parameters. So these are split up into pairs. So there's a pair of primary CV assignment parameters and a pair of secondary CV assignment parameters. So the primary parameters are VCA, filter cutoff, or both VCA and filter cutoff. So that's done top level with this small button. So this is the CV assignment button. I patch this in here, bring my cutoff down, take my bias all the way down, press it so it's white. I now have CV coming in, positively attenuverted. So it's more of a decay pluck. There you go. So CV control over a VCA going into our filter, with the ability to add a starting bias. Now if we want this to control the filter only, press the button until it goes yellow. So this is now no longer CV over the VCA. So this means I need to bring my bias up to a foundation floor. Bring my cutoff down, and I've now got the CV attenuverted controlling my cutoff frequency. So this of course modulates the cutoff in parallel to the volt per octave. So you could have key tracking configured and have more aggressive envelope motion or other modulation sources controlling your cutoff frequency. Press the button once more and we go to this off-white, yellow-white mix. So this is the CV through the attenuverter going to both VCA and filter cutoff. So this is where we're getting into low pass gate territories. So as the amplitude gets hotter, the brightness increases because we've got that direct parallel control over cutoff frequency and amplitude. So yeah, that's top level primary CV assignment between these 4 options. For secondary assignment, I can actually further map the CV through attenuverter to control the resonance. So we've actually got a voltage controlled resonant transistor ladder filter. So this is done through internal routing. If I go, let me set this so that we can still hear it. There we go. So to access these secondary parameters, if I press and hold the small button and then tap the big button 4 times, on the 4th press, that's going to enter our cycling option between the 4. So if I press it further times while the small button's still held, got blinking white, so this is CV mapped to resonance. Blinking yellow, I've got CV mapped to decay time of my strike envelope. And then blinking white yellow, I've got CV mapped to both resonance and the decay time. So let's try it over resonance. So that's quite aggressive. Bring resonance down to start with. There we are, we're getting more resonant peaks introduced as the CV increases. Last one, decay time. So what I'll do is take my bias and decay all the way down. So this is a good opportunity to look at the decay section or the strike section. So I'll patch my CV from a manual source. Take and turn it all the way down. So here I have, this is where we're very much in the low pass gate configuration territory. So this strike envelope is internally patched to both the cutoff frequency and the VCA. So with filter all the way down, VCA all the way down, and we've got the ability to immediately pluck sounds. I've now got CV not applied to either of the primary assignments, but as I bring up my manual CV here, let me patch a clock to this. Take my echoes off. There we go. So built-in strike decay. And that's me now disabled my secondary CV assignments. Cool. Okay, let's go back to envelope controlled. Slow that down a bit. Let's look at the last sections of the àradh. Referenced briefly before, the pre and post. You can see just in the scope alone, we can see a quite difference in the non-linear curvature of the resulting waveform. So this is pre, this is VCA Pre filter, it's out to post. This is the filter is getting attenuated, so we don't have any additional. It's similar to the question of whether you EQ before you compress or whether you compress for EQ. Both are valid signal flows, but if you EQ before you compress, as you change your EQ, if it gets more dramatic, then you're changing your fundamental amplitude. So your compressor is going to act differently. So same rule applies here. If I'm changing the stage of my VCA, if I set it to pre, then I'm adding an additional degree of dynamic wave shaping as the transistors are acting as a saturator. Yeah, I'll be digging into this a bit more throughout this video. I'm looking at some other more clear examples of where you might want to use one versus the other. Okay, let's look at our last jack here. This is the gate follow output. So this is a CV output that can be either disabled when this toggles in the center position, or I can set it to the down position, which point it's going to be generating an envelope output derived from a built-in envelope follower, or it'll generate gate signals that are also derived from the envelope signal. So let's look at the envelope generator first. I'm going to slow the oscilloscope down, patch this to channel 1. So we now see the envelope in green. You see this is the default setting of it, where it's got quite a quick attack and quite a quick release response by default. So it's going to be following these peaks of the signal as we go. What I'll do, I'll change to using just my built-in strike decay envelope, so we can now see these peaks of it more clearly. Okay, this is where things get a bit more deep. I've actually got secondary parameters that are controlled from the 3 tall trimmer pots. So bias, Q, resonance, and decay. Resonance and decay, they double up as attack and release for attack and release times of our envelope follower. So the way to access these is to do shift and turn. So shift is small button, then big button, press and hold. We then have the ability to change attack time. So I'll reduce that down. I'll increase my release time all the way up. So I now have very fast attack and very slow release. So we've now got a much smoother descending ramp. So if I now switch to using my gate output, we're going to have a really clean gate that's derived from this envelope. So the gates parameter is using the bias knob. So this sets the threshold. So as this is turned up, the threshold is increased. So it means that the envelope needs to hit a higher peak for that gate to be derived. So let me press and hold, turn it up a bit. Let's go to a little bit past 12 o'clock. There we go. So I've got a much shorter trigger response from this envelope, the envelope being that signal. So quite a useful utility, and I can actually use this for degree of self-patching, where if I have no CV patch to the input, the output of the gate and follow jack is actually internally normaled to this jack. So if this is unpatched, it receives a direct normal from it. So just to be aware, if you're not intending to use internal modulation, keep that toggle in the center position. So now if I engage this, I'm going to be striking my VCA to open and filter cutoff to open. That's then going to be driving the envelope follower, which is further modulating the amplitude of both. So this is actually going to be positive gain, positive feedback. There we go. If I turn this negative, then we're adding negative feedback. So we'll have the initial impulse, and it's going to be forcing a reduction in amplitude. So this is where we get into dynamics management territory. I very much designed the àradh to be able to function as a formal compressor as well. So I'll come back to a more detailed patch example showing that. Yeah, I think that about covers it. So I'm going to pull all these patch cables and rebuild and do some more step-by-step examples, kind of showing the àradh in a few different contexts. So yeah, hope you enjoy. Okay, I'm going to keep things quite traditional to start with. We'll just go with the classic sawtooth wave subtractive synthesis voice. So I'm going to take the sawtooth out from my CSL here. I'm going to run the input and the output signals through the data. That way we can see and hear in a bit of context. So that's sawtooth through channel 3, out of channel 3 through the àradh, out of the àradh through channel 4, and that's what we're going to listen to. There we go. So we can immediately see that very typical non-linear wave shaping that gets applied to a sawtooth ramp through a transistor ladder filter. Okay, so this is the àradh set in what I sort of designed as being the default, where this routing switch is in the pre position. So this is the VCA, which I'm controlling with the bias here. It's a manual offset. That's the VCA going into the filter. So maybe a bit less typical than the more expected subtractive patch signal flow, which is typically oscillator into filter into VCA. This is oscillator into VCA into filter. But because the cutoff goes all the way down, so it basically closes. So this is immediately in sort of low pass gate type territory where the filter can close completely. But it also means that I can use the VCA as a gain stage and really saturate the sawtooth into this filter. Okay, I'll keep it a bit more conservative just now, try and roughly match those amplitudes. I'll start bringing up some resonance. So this is another character trait that's very typical of ladder filters, where as resonance comes up, the overall amplitude decreases quite dramatically. So this is very, very similar to the tràigh filter's response when resonance is applied. But the àradh does have a little bit of dynamic compensation, so I tried to keep a more consistent RMS overall. So the main amplitude of the sawtooth doesn't decrease quite as dramatically. There's a bit of a built-in compensation. Okay, so this is set pre-VCA, pushing the sawtooth into the filter. So let's change this to post. Already we can hear and see there's quite a dramatic difference in response. So we're getting almost a more linear sawtooth coming through. Well, actually, I'm going to change this up to being a square wave. So this is VCA post filter. We'll bring resonance down. We can see that that amplitude is jumping way up there. Let's see what the core difference is between pre and post. This is post, this is pre. So we can kind of see the non-linearity is flipping in its position. So with the pre, post, you can see we're getting a sort of inversion of where that resonance prominence is applied. Okay, this has been very dry so far. Let's go back to our sawtooth wave, and I'm going to patch up something a bit more musical. So let's go with random steps from this tràigh down here. I'll quantize that to minor triad, and we'll patch that volt per octave to our oscillator. Okay, so the examples I've decided to show, these are a bit more general for, they can essentially apply to any filter. So it's just, I'm going to go through a few routines of different signal flows and concepts that I think are going to be a bit more generally applicable, but they'll all really show the àradh off in a very nice wide range of scenarios. Okay, so this is VCA Pre, so I can use that as a bit of saturation into the filter. Healthy amount of resonance. And as we can hear and see, this is static filter cutoff. So as the frequency of the carrier signal of the sawtooth wave increases, it's moving further into the stop band of the filter response. So it means that we're getting an attenuation in amplitude overall. So we're getting a lot less prominence to the sawtooth characteristic as those higher harmonics are filtered out. What I'll do briefly, I'll pull this and put this straight into a manual offset. So that's much more immediately prominent as I jump up in octaves. We're losing definition of that sawtooth shape. So I would need to move the cutoff frequency up to retain that better. So this is where the fundamental technique of key tracking comes into play. So volt per octave input on the àradh. So this can also serve as a volt per octave pitch control if we were to mute our input, kick it into self-oscillation, and have this track as a sine wave oscillator. So let me mult this volt per octave signal. There we go. Patch this back to a random source. There we go. Okay, so take resonance down, bring my carrier signal back up. There's quite an immediate difference already. If I take the key tracking out, this is the persistence of filter cutoff. So we're getting a change in timbre that's frequency dependent. So the higher the frequency, the more dull it is. As soon as I patch this key tracking, we're retaining consistency in the waveform now, because that filter cutoff stop band roll-off is moving directly in parallel with the volt per octave of the fundamental pitch. So consistent timbre to frequency. Let's get a bit more interesting. I'm going to use the gate output from my harmony. I'm going to patch that to this knock, and that's set to exponential. So this is now giving me a plucked decay envelope on every new note. And let's start off by patching this to control my cutoff frequency. So to do that, I'm going to be patching to the CV input, set the attenuverter up, and set the CV assign button to yellow, which is taking that CV through attenuverter, mapping it to filter cutoff. There we go. A bit more articulation per note. The key parameters to keep this musical is setting my fundamental cutoff position, so where it's returning to in relation to each note, because there's key tracking applied, and then the depth of modulation. So too high and it's going to get a bit too fizzy. It's a sweet spot where we're getting enough brightness to it without it getting a bit too harsh. But it's very much a balancing act between that starting point and then the depth of modulation. Resonance up a bit more. So this is where, as I'm sweeping the frequency cutoff manually, I'm changing that landing position of the filter cutoff. So the thing to compare directly here is without key tracking. So we have this dynamic modulation over the cutoff frequency, defined by the depth of modulation. But my starting point is going to be a static, so every time this envelope pulls it down, it's settling at the same cutoff position. So I've lost persistence of timbre here, where every note is frequency dependent for how bright it's going to be. So the brighter the note, the duller the timbre. Benefit of this configuration with no key tracking is I've got a more dramatic swing over manual sweep or slow parallel modulation. So if I have an LFO that's arcing through the cutoff frequency, then that's going to give me a lot more drama to that movement. As we retain that consistency per note with key tracking in. Okay, so this is modulation with that envelope over filter cutoff only. Let's bring that down. I'm going to now map it to my VCA. Bring my bias down so that there's a lower starting amplitude. So if I unpatch this, this is my resting amplitude of the VCA as it's going into the filter. Then as I'm plucking that, it's dynamic amplitude being applied to the carrier signal going into the filter. So the timbre with key tracking, it means that the cutoff frequency is following the sawtooth in parallel. So for these sort of voices, I can really use the resonance to my benefit and dial that in to be more prominent, set it to as close as I can to an integer multiple ratio of the fundamental, and that's me picking out particular overtones. So it's a much more acute timbre effect where you're really honing in and sculpting out particular overtones. So anytime there are those instabilities on notes, it's very akin to soft sync, where we're forcing a number of resonant oscillations into the cycle of the sawtooth. Let's compare this to the VCA being set to post. post-filter. Things are a lot more percussive and plucky now. So that's because I've got timbre that's staying consistent. Set that to being brighter, and it's just amplitude that's being attenuated. So this is a much more traditional oscillator filter VCA. So the resonance gets a lot more fizzy in this configuration when it's set to post, so it can get a little bit too shrill at times. Let's directly compare. So this is VCA post filter, VCA pre filter. Very different responses from the resonance with the same resonance amount, and that's because the amplitude's either dynamic going into the filter or it's constant going into the filter. Okay, let's go to our third routing option. So this is much more low pass gate territory, where I have the envelope opening the VCA as well as opening the filter cutoff in parallel. So resonant low pass gating. And again, we'll get very different timbres if I set it to post versus pre. Because we're retaining the same amount of brightness with the sawtooths going into the filter and staying at a constant amplitude, is then being attenuated afterwards. So both low pass gate type responses, but quite different character traits. Okay, let's move to something that's a bit more of a complex starting voice. This is just a straight sawtooth wave. I'm going to swap that out for the super saw that's going to come from the sigma output of the Cruin. Let's take this modulation out just now. I could just leave that in, just disable it here. Take out my key tracking. Okay, I'm going to roll off my output level to try and retain a bit more of a traditional sawtooth ramp. We're seeing on an imperfect sawtooth wave, we're getting some resonance peaks coming through at the artifacts. Okay, let's start adding in the super saws. More like it. Bring our enveloping back in. I've got this set to filter cutoff only, and I've got the VCA Pre. So I'm able to use the VCA as an extra saturation stage into the filter. Add volt per octave, which is this one. Add key tracking. Let me just go through a few of the options again, and we'll just hear it sort of as comparisons as we go, using this new super saw as a reference voice. So this is VCA Pre, VCA Post. Much brighter overall. Pre. Things are a bit tighter. It doesn't quite get shrill. Back to Pre, I'm going to set this to being CV over VCA. So we have key tracking still engaged here, so there is movement of the filter cutoff in parallel to the fundamental pitch. I'll take that off. Let's go post filter. Bring the bias down a bit. So now with bias brought all the way down, my envelope is the only source controlling the amplitude. So if there's no CV, it's going to be silent. Let's go back to pre. Let's go to our third option. This is CV over both filter cutoff and VCA. With key tracking. Okay, let's go back to my preferred default, which is CV over cutoff frequency, static VCA, and a bit of resonance. And I'm going to switch out to one last oscillator source as an example. I'm going to come down to the tràigh here, which is similar to the crún in terms of being a supersaw. Overall, the RMS of the tràigh is a little bit lower. That's because if we isolate and look at just the red waveform, it's perfectly linear for all the various sawtooth waves, whereas there's a lot of quite aggressive saturation and soft clipping applied at the crún by design. That's because if potentially up to 6 sawtooth waves summed together, the amplitudes can get very quickly into hard clipping territories. So with the tràigh, I brought the overall amplitude down just to keep it into a safer spot. So yeah, the àradh was very much designed to be a third in the chain of harmony and tràigh. Okay, let's add our volt per octave. Key tracking back in. Add in sub-octave on the first oscillator. Let's play with some interval offsets. So this is introducing unisons, octaves, perfect fifths, perfect fourth intervals. Pretty good for maybe fat synth lead voices or bass tones. Okay, let's do what the tràigh really does best, and that's turn things a bit more harmonic. Keep the interval offsets off. Let's patch in our diatonic third. And make this a full triad at the perfect fifth. Okay, I'll take this off CV controlled, and I'm going to set the harmony to just being manually controlled. And I'm also going to go a bit more traditional. Let's go with the ADSR and the cease. Keep that nice and slow. Okay, let's go down a register. And I'll set this to being open voicing. Add a little bit of extra touch. I've put this CSL top voice in LFO range. I'll use a sine wave as a vibrato source. I'm aiming for about 4 or 5 hertz or so. Let's go to CV over both VCA and filter cutoff. Okay, let's increase attack and release so I can just one-shot this and get a nice swoop. I'm going to modify this a bit further just to get it a little bit more cinematic. I've got a looper here that's running a couple of just free time loops. I'll set them to be continually recording. So these are both currently set to no input monitoring and just constantly recording over themselves. So I'm going to mult my signal to both inputs. Let's go from here, patch that to both. I'm going to branch once more and send that to channel 1 on my card. So this will act as my core. Mono dry signal. And let's come from both outputs in parallel. I'll send these to a stereo, like left and right configuration on 2 and 3. Okay, if I mute 1, then we should hear this as 2 parallel delays, hard left, hard right. We'll speed them up a bit. Bring up mono center. Okay, now we need some feedback. I've got both loops set with dub level all the way down, so it is just a single constantly dubbing recording. And for feedback, I'm actually going to use this second àradh here. So I'm going to use the aux output of the looper, come from the aux output into this àradh, out of the àradh back to the aux input. We'll get more of that sort of sustained tape echo, ping pong delay. Pretty nice. Okay, well, I'm gonna rip all these patch cables out and start again and do some more examples. See you in a minute. Okay, let's dig into a bit of low-pass gating. Got a few fun examples that I thought would be quite cool to capture on camera. To start with, I'm going to be using the CSL as my main source for this. I've actually got both oscillators tuned to a unison. And just double check that's still the case. Sawtooth on one. Yeah, that's pretty close. I'll do the job. Okay, so I'm going to start with the top voice, Sawtooth, and this will be my main waveform. Just lock the scope to that. Okay, I'm going to go through the scope, through this àradh as a low-pass gate, back through the scope, just so we can see the result. And let's send that to our output. Okay, resonant low-pass filtering, VCA control, I've got it set pre. I've got the VCA into the filter. That way the resonance sort of tightens up quite nicely compared to post, where I'm essentially amplifying this resonant filter. But yeah, resonance can ring out a little bit. I think it stays a lot tighter, a lot more musical when it's running VCA pre-filter. Let's go with that. And we're going to be focusing in around this guy, or decay envelope. So this is very much designed and curated to behave like a traditional West Coast low-pass gate. Low-pass gating is essentially a combination of low-pass filtering and VCA. So as the amplitude reduces, you get reduction in amplitude, of course, but you also get a dynamic reduction in high-frequency content. So the low-pass cutoff lowers in conjunction with the amplitude. So that's what's happening here, because this decay envelope is patched directly internally to the VCA and the filter cutoff. So let's use a clock. I'm going to use the clock output from this tie here. Just patch that straight to the strike input. When researching the development of this, I was looking at a lot of classic low-pass gate implementations, and you get quite a lot that are resonant capable, but very often I would see it would be a case of resonance on or resonance off. So I think adding the dynamic amount of resonance that can be applied, as well as being able to increase gain into the filter stage, it's makes for a really versatile low pass gate. Okay, let's get some more notes in here. I'm going to quantize the sample and hold that's coming from this tie. There we go, a bit more note definition. So what I'm quite interested in getting is this variability of decay time. So dynamic manipulation over the decay time. And I can do that with the secondary CV mapping. So holding small button, tapping big button 4 times, and have the ability to map to resonance, decay time, or both. Let's try resonance first, just to see what sort of effect we get. Dynamic resonance. Resonance down. A bit more basic low pass gating. I'm going to use the random output from the tie. So this is giving me random steps, unipolar positive 0 to 10. Patch the CV and attenuate to taste. So to dial this into a better sweet spot, I might want to set a lower limit range of resonance. Let's see the bottom peaks just starting to wobble a bit. Bring my depth up slightly. Yeah, subtlety is often just the simplest trick in patching, is just finding that lower limit of where you want it musically to sit with resonance, and then just add a little bit of depth so that it's deviating a little bit around that. So just adding accents. Reduce that down a bit. Extend the range. Okay, now I'm going to cycle one step further and add CV over decay time as well as resonance. This way, when I'm getting a longer decay time, I'm also getting a little bit more resonance. So the range of the controls I dialed in to be a good average level of consistency, so that in this case I've got the same linear CV range attenuverted to the same peak to peak, and that's internally being applied to resonance as well as decay. So in these positions I'm getting a nice musical deviation in decay time, so I'm getting some more musical accents. But the resonance isn't overpowering when it does hit. It stays a bit more reined in. Yeah, that's cool. Okay, let's go a step further. So because the àradh is quite a nice small form factor, let's add a second. So I've got one down here, and I'm going to use this to low pass gate the other voice of my CSL. So in this case I'm going to come from the wave folder, because that will give me a good amount of timbre range that I can play with. I'll run through the scope as well, just to see what's happening. Input, I'll go through my last channel. And that's going to go to another channel on the Karn. Bring my initial one down. Okay, so this is also set to VCA Pre filter. So this being a wave-folded sound, The filtering behaves very differently because it's symmetrical wavefolding. So it's prioritizing odd harmonic combinations. So very different in behavior when we add resonance to it, because there's not a hard edge for resonance to resonate from so much. So it's kind of more of a gentle timbre shift. So bring them down and let's try the decay. Bring that up a bit. Turn the volume up. Cool. It's a starting point. I'm going to double my clock. So I'm going to take a mult from my master clock here and actually parallel clock a second tie. So it's now going to be following the same tempo. If I wanted everything locked in time, I could just use the same clock fundamentally, but there's a trick here with the tie. So same thing, I want to add some dynamic modulation over the decay time. So do the same thing, I'll pull a random voltage source from here. Actually, before I do that, what I might do is add so the quantizer is quantizing random sampling of the noise source from this tie. There we go. So I'm now just sampling an oscillating triangle wave from this knock as my source. So I get a bit more of a musical ostinato. So as I open up the filter on its own, the VCA is still being struck directly from the decay envelope. But if I set an offset to my cutoff frequency, then it's acting more as an enveloped VCA because there's less noticeable difference in spectral content, so we don't have that high-end roll-off occurring. Okay, let's add random CV over decay time. So secondary CV mapping, press and hold small, tap the big 4 times, and cycle the groove to yellow. Cool. Okay, let's bring up my original patch. So here's my sawtooth patch. The squelchiness of the resonance is definitely coming through. Okay, let's add some more interesting rhythmic elements. Getting some rhythmic rolls and ratchets on the second oscillator, or second low pass gate. Let's go a step further here. Because I'm using the harmony, I can actually tune these to a diatonic dyad. Quite cool. Okay, Let's add one final pass. One more CV source from this tie. Add variable panning to our second oscillator. Solo that, so we should just be getting a bit of spatialization deviation between left and right. I'm going to reduce my decay time slightly. Make everything a bit more plucky. Let's go with a parallel output from my mixer. Send that to this looper, which is running as just two asynchronous constant tracking loops. There we go, a bit of ambience to it. Could even go stereo for this, because we've got one additional channel. Hard left, hard right. And other than the knock being used as an LFO, I don't have any envelopes in this patch at all. All the percussive stuff's coming from the built-in strike envelopes on the àradhs. So for this last example, I'm going to take things in a slightly unusual direction. We're not going to use the àradh as a low-pass filter, but we're actually going to look at compression and ways of using the àradh as a form of dynamics manager, which not a typical use case for a low-pass filter, but it's an element that I very much had in mind as I was developing it. So yeah, we'll see as we get into the nuts and bolts of it all. There are some specific quirks that I designed with this configuration in mind. So for these examples, I'm going to be using a loop playback of one of the drum loops from the Instruō sample library. I'm going to run that directly through channel 3 here. So we're seeing the original signal in red. I will mult this to this 1F, and this will become my output source. And I'll patch it direct so we're bypassing the limiter of the Karn. Okay, and now we need the output of this. So this is my dry drum signal. It's going into the àradh, out of the àradh, and we're seeing that on yellow. Match those visually. Now this output to top input of this 1F. So here I'm able to crossfade between my dry and my filtered version. I've used the àradh in quite a lot of performances in this sort of way, not necessarily as compression actually, and just using it for softening drum voices to get more low and mid-range passing. Okay, here we go. So that's somewhat transparent in terms of comparison between them. I'm going to patch out from, there we go, I've engaged the envelope follower now, so we can see that represented in yellow. I'm going to patch that to channel 1. As we can see, I've got the scope offset positive, and this is generating a positive envelope, which I can then attenuate as needed when it's normal to the CV input. But for visual reference, I'm going to actually patch this through channel 3 of the Carn. And that way I just have a visual representation of gain reduction. So I'm just inverting that envelope just so I can see it inverted on the scope. I'm not actually using this output anywhere, because I'll just be pulling it direct and using the attenuator that's built in. Okay, and this is actually all I need now for using this as a compressor. Because we think about compression, in a nutshell, it's just amplitude modulation. It's just dynamics management. So we're listening to the dry original source. And now if I want to reduce amplitude, compressors just look for peaks coming from amplitude peaks. So in this case, there's a lot of heavy transients with it being a drum voice. So I want to just turn it down on the hi-hats. So that's me just riding the volume and we hear it pumping. So it's essentially that same mechanism, but automated based on envelopes derived from the source audio. And all I need to do is engage my CV routing to the VCA, set my bias to the 12 o'clock position, and this is setting my default input gain, essentially. As I reduce this negative, we're losing loudness, and this is the envelope starting to really pull down following that gain reduction curve of it. Now the issue being, if I go fully dry, you should hear that there's a bit more prominence in terms of loudness of the original signal because it's not being attenuated dynamically. Whereas here, we can hear the amplitudes being pulled down following the transients. So this is the natural behavior of a compressor. The parameter to compensate for this is generally called makeup gain. So we can get around that by just using our bias and pushing that up to try and compensate and match the original loudness level of it before it was compressed. So this is now uncompressed. I mean, these are quite heavily produced drum tracks that have compression on them anyway, but this is the dry version of it that we're listening to. And this is the àradh compression. So the 5 typical parameters of a compressor are threshold, ratio, attack, release, and makeup gain. So threshold and ratio, they're essentially tied into these controls here. So as I'm turning the negative depth of CV control from my envelope, that's applying the gain reduction to the VCA. So that's ducking it down in the opposite direction from the starting bias. The threshold and ratio is kind of an amalgamation between those configurations. So depending on where the bias is set and how much negative amplitude there is of the envelope, that's setting our threshold and ratio. So there's not a strict ratio and threshold parameter. It's kind of a balancing act between the two. Makeup gain is also tied into it, being using the bias. So attack, release are the next ones. So they're the temporal parameter. So you're setting how fast or slow the envelope is that's coming from the source audio. So as we know from previous demonstration, the secondary parameters that get controlled by these pots, resonance and decay, they're giving us, let's take resonance off of it, it should be a bit more transparent, compression. There we go. So this will give me attack and release response of my compressor. So I'm just going to reach in here and press and hold these as shift, and then I can change my attack and release times. Do this slightly awkwardly so I'm keeping the scope in view. Okay, so this is getting into really aggressive territories. I've gone for a shorter attack time and a long release time. So that's a really fast response and a slow release back to original. So that's where we're getting that really aggressive pumping. So compared to dry. Now, this is a compressor dialed into extremes, but this can be very useful, especially when we've got a combination like this where I've got a direct wet-dry mix between the two. This is essentially parallel compression, where if I can bring up a mix between the two, it's a very nice trick for a mastering stage, is to run a parallel compressor and have it really quite aggressive on your percussion voice over your drum tracks, and it especially the highs, the cymbals, the hi-hats, like the bigger swells of that, they'll just get enhanced a bit more with a little bit of parallel compression like this. Whereas you would never want to actually listen to the compressed track itself. So the other trick for compression that's going to be a bit more subtle than this is go with a slightly slower attack, which will mean it's going to respond a little bit more sluggish compared to the onset transients. And it means that it's going to be essentially using the natural latency. So a transient hits and it takes a bit of time for the envelope to respond and start to reduce the gain. So it means that we can actually tighten up transients to a degree. Yeah, we can maybe see on the scope, look for the kick transients. On the yellow, it sort of tightens up following the peak, but the amplitude of the initial onset of the transient is still retained. So it's a way of helping get transient hits to pop a bit more. Okay, so that's a crash course in compression. Let's look at what else the àradh can do in this configuration. If I invert it, or set it the correct way. So here's a quirk. So I've now muted my VCA and we now have no envelope, even though turning up the CV input, this should be turning up any CV to open the VCA. But it only happens when I've got a certain degree of bias incorporated. So this is expansion, where if my input signal is completely attenuated, there's nothing for the envelope follower to be derived from. Whereas if I have a small amount up, then I don't need a lot of amplitude because the whole thing's got positive feedback in the configuration. So it's a bit of a fine line balancing point. So this is expansion. So if the higher amplitude hits will amplify themselves, so you end up with the ability for similar to the mechanic of noise gating, but here we're doing it a bit more soft. What I'll do, I'll speed up the attack time, set the release maybe a bit on the slow side. So another trick here is if I hold both buttons and change my envelope follower source to being pre-filter, this is now setting it coming from the direct input. So even if the filter is all the way down and the VCA is all the way down, we're actually deriving the envelope follower directly from the input. So it's pre-everything. So this means if I have my bias all the way down, bring up my filter cutoff, I'm getting expansion without the risk of it running away and feeding back into itself, because the envelope follower is derived in parallel from the input source. So this can also give us a slightly different behavior to the compression. There we are. That's getting a bit more dramatic because we don't have this more sluggish feedback compression configuration. So this is a feed forward or parallel tracking compression. There we go. No compression. Really aggressive compression. Or go the other way and we have expansion. So of course this is just ignoring the filter stage of the àradh. So if I go the other way, change this to being filter, so CV now no longer affects the VCA, this is now just static. Let's apply negative essentially have spectral compression, where the higher the amplitude of the envelope, which is coming from the higher amplitude hit, the higher the transient, it's going to be pulling the filter down. Going the opposite way might be more useful in this case. So my envelope source back to being post filter. Again, much more aggressive ducking now. Of course, I'm playing with the positive feedback in certain instances here, so it's getting into somewhat dangerous territories. Amplitudes being able to run away with themselves. Okay, so fundamentally this is showing the use case of expansion versus compression. There's also gating options. Okay, so now I've got the gate derived from the output. I can actually change this to being positive indication now. So now my gate is going positive whenever it is actually positive on the green channel. I'm going to speed up my attack time. Keep the least reasonable, that way it's sort of slewing at a more natural rate. Yeah, there's the envelope. And now if I play with the threshold, too much. This is allowing me to isolate my kicks. So what I've done now, I've set my envelope follower to be post filter, which means I can roll it down a bit, so I'm filtering out the mids and highs a bit more to isolate down to just the kick hits. I've got bias all the way down, so VCA is closed. I've got CV assigned to both VCA and filter. So as the gate goes high, it's opening up the filter, so returning to full bandwidth audio. And it's also opening up the VCA. So I'm extracting just the low frequency hits. So I'm not sure this would necessarily be the most useful of patches to go to, but it can do it. And it's a nice proof of concept for these more obscure features. Back to compression. So yeah, you'll probably be able to tell the attack and release times for the envelope follower, they're not as general purpose or generic as the likes of using a full wave rectifier and a function generator to give you full linear or exponential shaped variability over your attack and release times. Especially when you increase the attack duration, I've got a lot of compensation under the hood for the àrahd's envelope follower, so it essentially adds compensation gain to make sure you don't lose amplitude of this envelope too much. That way it stays in a sweet spot overall, especially for drum compression. So it's this sort of high transient percussion compression that I really optimized for. Yeah, so dynamics management from the àradh.